navigate us through a transition to a remote work setting, responding to a pandemic, expanding our staff, all while still supporting the community. What are your reflections on how the Community Foundation was able to do this all?
Well, thank you, Bianca. I think coffee is the key here. Thank you. I'm just thrilled to be here with you, Bianca, and kicking off this learning series together. It's exciting, and just want to acknowledge that we're in different places. We're still in this remote work environment, and so we're all of our tech team and Daisy, we're in separate places, and it's a little, I consider a little awkward, having our conversation in this Zoom virtual format, even after so many months of doing this together. But I'm thrilled to be here with you, Bianca, and I'm just grateful to everybody, all my virtual friends, the foundation friends and family who are on with us. We had over 80 people register to join, and I hope you all have your coffee cups or tea cups with you. This is just a conversation between Bianca and me about some reflections on the past year and a look ahead, as she mentioned. So welcome to all of you. We're thrilled you're here, and thank you for taking time. I wish I could see you all in person. Wish we could be together soon. So Bianca, you asked, sort of how did we get here? That's a really good question. And in thinking about it and reflecting back, I've done a lot of reflecting over the past year. And I think the first thing I want to say is emergency response, as so many know, and many of you on this call know very, very well, is a team sport. And it's based on, to have a foundation, a real root in a community of care. And we're very fortunate in Western Massachusetts to have a community that cares deeply about friends and neighbors, known and unknown to us. So that was the start, I think. And I just want to say a thank you to the Community Foundation staff, because in a team sport, they are definitely the core team. And they were just remarkable, really incredible, extraordinary in their ability to move very quickly to remote work and get things up and running in a safe way and a productive way. I think the other piece was, our trustees, our volunteers, and our partners were right there with us. So even though we were apart, people were offering support right away. So for example, I think we launched our COVID response fund on March 13th of 2020. And that was a Friday. And on Monday, our long-term partners in MassMutual had made a commitment of $1 million to seed that fund, because we didn't know those few days before how we were going to support the work, and we didn't know what the work would be. So I think that was, having partners like the Davis Foundation and the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts. I know Paul and Donna are on the call. So grateful for their lending staff. They actually lent us staff. Donna herself and Magnus Monroe from the Davis Foundation supported the work of the Community Foundation, many, many, many hours devoted to that work. We also had volunteers like Paul Murphy and Francia Wisniewski from Franklin County, who gave tons of time. So people really stepped up. And the most incredible thing happened at the same time, which is the community just opened their hearts and poured out incredible generosity. Hundreds and hundreds of people stepped forward with gifts of $5 to $150,000. Over 700 individual gifts arrived in those first months. And in fact, we also saw something really unusual happen, I think, and many of you on this call will recognize how unusual this is, that we saw a tripling of our receiving of gifts to the Community Foundation last year. Nearly tripled the amount on an average year. And half of the funding that went into our COVID response fund came from outside the region. And that was really unusual. And what I saw starting, what I think is an emerging trend, was the recognition that places like Boston, Greater Boston, have enormous wealth generated, created there, and sort of had traditionally stayed there. And there was a recognition, I feel, for maybe the first time that I was seeing it from folks in that area, that there was going to be desperate need beyond the confines of Greater Boston, and that it was their responsibility to make sure that those who were in need across the Commonwealth received that. And so redistributing those philanthropic dollars to create philanthropic equity we started seeing that. And Governor Baker's wife, Lauren Baker, she stepped forward along with the 1-8 Foundation, and I think it was over 18,000 individuals and foundations who contributed to the statewide Mass COVID Relief Fund, raising over $30 million. They made the decision to distribute those dollars outside of Greater Boston to help create more philanthropic equity. I mean, this is really unusual. And that kind of support from outside the region pouring in helped us develop some really new and unique partnerships.
Katie, can we pause right there for a minute?
Yes.
What do you think attributed to that recognition? I always hear and have heard over the years, funneling to Western Mass sometimes is very hard. And within 1 year, that seems to be changing. What do you think attributed to that recognition that we need a lot more support out here?
It's such a good question, Bianca, and I'm not sure I have the answer, but what I think was happening is that the conversations around equity and justice that were happening all, for years, let's face it, but had been increasing over the last few years. And data. I think data to demonstrate that equity isn't necessarily about per capita. That's sort of equality, but this recognition slowly around this idea that that there wasn't equity in terms of funding around philanthropy. And the data, there have been a number of studies nationally, and we had one, Philanthropy Massachusetts shared a report very recently about the per capita philanthropic dollars in our region, and it mirrors national trends, which is where the dollars are made, they sort of stay there and aren't seen in other areas where there's fewer numbers of people in population, or where there are fewer dollars being generated in terms of wealth and philanthropy. And so Suffolk County, for example, if you look at their per capita, how philanthropy per capita is seen in Suffolk County. And this excludes foundation and excludes higher education, because that really can warp things. But their per capita was sort of 40 times what it is here in Hampden, Hampshire, and Franklin counties. And the needs are very similar. And so I think folks getting that data, beginning to understand the difference between equity and equality, and recognizing, I think an emergency response also played into this, that we were in a significant emergency, and folks know from the data who is going to be most adversely affected in emergencies. And it's those who have been traditionally targeted and marginalized in our communities. And so that was, I think there's also a national sort of conversation in the foundation world around this issue. And I think that led to because we saw that in both corporate and private foundations in the Boston area, reaching out and making distributions all over the state as a result.
Thank you. That actually leads me into my next question.
Oh, great.
It was very important for me to have joined an organization that has intentionally embarked upon a journey of diversity and inclusion, and that it looks at all their work through a lens of equity. How did you get to a place to determine that this was the direction the Community Foundation needed to go? And can you share any tidbits of what this journey has entailed to date?
I'd be happy to. This is such an important topic and one just so central to our work day in and day out at the foundation right now. I just want to take us back more than a year ago. I think part of the reason why we were able to focus our efforts in terms of the emergency response was because of the long 12-month process we had undertaken in our strategic planning that really allowed us a lot of opportunity for reflection, a lot of opportunity to take data into consideration, surveying of residents and donors and our nonprofit grantee partners. Lots and lots of information and data was collected, and that helped inform our conversations, our discussions and dialogues. And I think having had that 12 months of work put us in a position to recognize where our priorities wanted to be, where we were putting our priorities and what kind of a strategic vision we had. And so that helped us in terms of our COVID response. It helped us in terms of, you mentioned, we brought on lots of new staff members. So we were very focused in that way because we had these new priority areas to be really honing in on. And the new vision, strategic vision for the Community Foundation that came out of that 12 months of study, debate, and conversation was to advance equity and opportunity for all who live in our region. And that is a first in terms of highlighting and centralizing equity in our work. Through the strategic planning process, we recognized that we can't do everything and that we had to focus in particular areas where we had strengths, where we had partnerships already, where there might be gaps for funding and support in our community. And so we identified 5 areas where we thought we had the best chance at creating impact around advancing equity and opportunity. And one of those was very obvious to us, which is to advance diversity and inclusion. We know that that leads to greater equity and justice. And we wanted to be able to do that with partners. It's not something you can do alone, and to be having an impact across our 3-county region. We also recognized that we had a lot of work to do and needed to start internally. So that was 2019, early 2020. And I think initially I and the trustees and the distribution committee and staff, maybe not all staff, I won't speak for everyone, but I felt like we need to start first with ourselves. And then we could do work externally with partners and with the community. And what I quickly realized with the murder of George Floyd and the many instances of police brutality toward our Black and Brown citizens, and the response that we all saw, the racial reckoning, the protests that we saw, the urgency became really clear that we couldn't simply work internally. We had to do both. And that's challenging when you don't have the structures in place and the skill base, and you don't have necessarily all the resources that you want in order to do the work well externally. So we did seek some support from a national consultant. We had hired in January of 2020, thinking we would start March of 2020 on this work. That had to be delayed a couple of months, but we did get started working with them in the summer last year. And what started as a 12-month consulting partnership has turned into more like 18 months and beyond. And We added a new staff person, a vice president position for people and culture to support this work. We have invested lots and lots of time, effort, and energy into the work. So I guess, Bianca, your question is you had sort of three parts, I think. One is sort of, how did we get here? Why did we make this a priority? And the second thing I think you wanted to know is sort of some reflection, some tidbits of how it's gone.
Yes,
right?
The journey to date. It's been a very long year, and we've had a lot of intense conversations internally, and I think really embarked upon a very intentional journey. And I would just really love to relay to our participants, if anyone wanted to start, what could you share with them about the intention behind the importance of what we're doing here?
Well, there's so much to say. We definitely don't have time to. This would be a great topic for a conversation. I'd love to do it when we could have more of a dialogue with lots of the folks that are in this virtual room with us, because I'm not an expert. I'm humbled every day in this work. And I think what has been helpful is having gone through that strategic planning process and having everyone, trustees, our distribution committee, our staff, centered around a set of priorities that incorporate this. I think having expert help is critical. If you have that on your teams, if you're an individual and you can access expert support and training, that is really, it's critical. It's a personal journey and it's a structural, institutional journey. And both of those things have to happen at the same time. And it's not one with a finish line. And that's really challenging because, as you said, it's been a long year. It's hard and difficult work, but with expertise, with commitment, and with increased knowledge and skills. So training, learning. I think the other really important part of this work is doing it in partnership and making time for reflection, because I think the reflection times gives everyone it gives you a chance to pause. It gives you a chance to breathe, to recognize when you need to take care of yourself, and also to acknowledge where you've gone wrong and learn from those mistakes. I think when we started this journey, many people who had been on it for a long time said to me, this is going to be difficult. You're going to make tons of mistakes. It's going to be really painful. And I didn't know what they meant. I thought, well, I'm a hard worker. I'm committed. I'm tough. But it is hard. And it's so critical though. And it's so important. And I'm just so grateful to the trustees of the distribution committee and the staff who've made this commitment, because that's what makes progress happen. And we've seen that. So I think just knowing that just being able to acknowledge we are not the experts. The Community Foundation is by no means the experts. We are by no means, at the finish line of this journey. We're at the beginning of the journey. And I think, Bianca, the other thing that I felt was important was to try to create greater equity, that transparency is really an important piece of this, building trust through communication and transparent dialogue. And one of the things we started to do a year ago was a blog series. It was a monthly series written by me or by a staff member or trustee, just trying to reflect on what we were doing internally, to share it, to sort of open the doors so folks could see what we were doing, and also to invite dialogue, to hear from others, because learning from others is how, where are we going wrong? What are we missing is so important. So I think transparency, communication in that way, it's just, there's so much more to be done, and finding allies in the work is really important. I know for me, in my learning journey, I sought out an accountability partner who did not work at the Community Foundation, who did readings with me, and on a bi-weekly basis, we met for 2 hours and discussed the readings and talked through issues. I worked with a series of 3 other Community Foundation CEOs. We started meeting last year around the COVID response weekly, and that morphed into conversations around advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism. And that's been a huge help as well to connect in with colleagues. So Bianca, what would you also recommend, or maybe you have some reflections, please, I don't feel like I have all the answers, but I'm sharing my reflections of what it has meant to try to stay curious and to try to really transform a culture in our organization from being very transactional and to being equity centered, and to take the time and to change process, change practice. And we are really at the beginning.
I think you explained it perfectly. And with everything that you just said, it is transformational, and it does take time, and it is a process, and it is all hands on deck, and we are not doing it alone. But thank you for your leadership through this process, because it is intentional, it is hard. We won't lie to anyone on this call, but we're looking for impact at the end of this journey, whatever it looks like. So thank you.
Well, Bianca, I just want to underscore your word, transformation. If you're going into it just to learn, to understand, I think that's great, but we have to get into this work to transform, to change, to take action that will actually create equity and transform the way our community works for everyone. And that can't come without, pain and discomfort. And I just encourage everyone who's doing this work to reach out to each other. I mean, I would just love to hear from folks about what's working, what isn't working, where things have fallen down. Can we have the conversation together in person, on social media, on the blog, whatever. I'm really eager to hear from others, because I know so many who are doing this deeply and intentionally as well.
I think we actually have some questions in the chat. So I'm going to bring Daisy in so that she can ask some questions on behalf of our attendees.
Hello, everybody. I'm Daisy. I'm the Director of Philanthropy at the Foundation. I have an excellent question here, and I'm actually going to take it, Katie. The question is, do you imagine a way to work with donors around some of these issues, race, power dynamics, learning from organizations we give to? Absolutely. That is what this learning series is all about. Emma, our marketing director, has named the series Evolve Philanthropy. And the message is that this is a transformation that we're working towards, bringing the donor of today to the donor that we need to support a more equitable future. So our team is working on these conversations on a daily basis. We are working with donors on building partnership, on power sharing, and sometimes even relinquishing power. The next session that we will be having in September, that will be led by Rima Dael of WHSU, will be about the responsibility of philanthropy in building a more equitable community. So we do imagine, we have lots of thoughts on how we want to work with donors. And part of that is taking ownership. Us in the philanthropy world have to take ownership of our responsibility in perpetuating inequities. start there, apologize, work together to learn and do better, and put in action what we know is needed to be more equitable. And that's all about partnership. There's nothing that we should be doing for a community without that community representation at the table. So more to come. This question, I could spend a whole day talking about this, but I wanted to acknowledge that and say that, yes, this is what we're doing. And the series is starting off as a 4-parter, but it is an intentional series that will continue for at least this fiscal year and probably throughout. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy.
Oh, Daisy, thank you so much. I want to just acknowledge, I think that Donna Hagegat of the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts is on the line, and she, the Women's Fund has been doing lots of great work in this area, and Donna and I have been convening the funders in Western Massachusetts, and Donna's been brought a lot of energy towards this particular type of work too. So we are definitely working in partnership and hoping to learn from each other and link arms to move this kind of work forward. So thanks for the question and thanks for the great answer.
So I will move on to another question for you, Katie.
Yeah.
As part of the development team, we are excited, as Daisy mentioned, to be working on the learning series. The series will provide opportunities to learn about the evolving world of philanthropy. Can you touch upon some of the changes you are seeing in the philanthropic landscape?
Absolutely. I was thinking as Daisy was responding that there's, as she said, we could talk all day about it. We've been thinking about it and learning and planning together. So one of the things I was offered an opportunity to write a piece for the Nonprofit Quarterly recently, and it has a lot to do with all of this in terms of what Daisy was saying, sort of acknowledging that we as funders have been operating in a way that has added to inequity, even if that wasn't the intention. And so acknowledging and understanding where those practices lie and how we can change them. And also, as we've been talking over and over again, and everyone's gonna be tired of hearing partnership, but that's in partnership with others. We can't do this, this work alone. So in that article, and also in the work we've been doing to reimagine and to evolve our philanthropy, we've been learning from others across the country who've been doing this work as well. And there are lots and lots of models or that sort of a movement to create these new models around funders and those they are funding as a more power sharing partnership. And there's lots of different ways, things that we have been looking at, different models we've been looking at, but they share some common characteristics. And one of them, as Daisy alluded to, nothing about us without us, is this co-designed idea. This is working together in sort of traditional old school, philanthropy. Foundations would get an understanding through data and evaluation of what was happening in their communities, what the needs were. Then oftentimes foundations would design a solution. And then they would invite nonprofit organizations to apply for funding to do that solution, to make that solution real, to implement. And for many years, folks have been saying, "Hey, this is not the way to do this," because it's the communities who understand, it's people who understand what their needs are, and so that has been changing for many decades. But it's hard to change, and sometimes systems, have sort of shadows of former selves. So co-designing really intentionally with people to understand, to listen. The data gathering has been so focused quantitatively for years, and now this idea of bringing in qualitative data together with quantitative data to really listen and understand what the needs are and what the solutions might be. As I mentioned before, just more transparency. It used to be this sort of shadow, you know, how are foundations operating? How are funders operating? I don't understand that donor, even individual people who are givers, sort of masked and opaque and hard to access and hard to understand. So this idea of just opening things up and being, you know, letting the light in and being much more transparent, reducing barriers to funding so that the applications aren't necessarily trying to remove organizations, but to find the organizations that are the best match for this, and trying to reduce those barriers to folks who would be applying. Finding new ways to find partnerships as opposed to the traditional application. Maybe there's a new way of doing it. Maybe it's in person, having a conversation. I mean, imagine that. But this idea, I think Daisy mentioned power sharing. We've had a really incredible experience working in this way with the Barr Foundation in Boston. So we've been a grantee of theirs, and that has allowed us to learn to see this type of approach in real time of what it means to have a shared, co-designed, very transparent, supported partnership in the work, both the funder and the grantee. And so that has been transformative for us over the last 4 years. That partnership has been ongoing, which another characteristic of the sort of changing face of philanthropy is these one-time contributions from donors and funders. That's really not what a partnership, that's a transaction. So the idea of a partnership is living, breathing, working together over the course of, if we're talking about serious long-term issues, it's going to take, Bianca, you just said about, you know, it's a process and it takes time when we're talking about building equity and anti-racism. So thinking that we could make one grant 1 year, and I'm speaking for the funders as a whole, not simply the community foundation, but that, you know, that doesn't make sense. So this idea of multi-year ongoing longer-term partnership we learned from Barr and others. I think a few other things center around trust and trusting the expertise of each other's, and this idea that in a partnership, both partners need each other, both are learning from each other, and both are giving something to each other. So that mutual support, mutual learning. And that was really interesting to us in our experience with the Barr Foundation, which is a multi-billion-dollar foundation, private. We're a community foundation, you know, serving 3 counties in the western part of the state. And you felt like we were two totally different beings. But in reality, we needed them, they needed us. And when we could have those conversations around co-designing, it was just magical because it was the amplification of the impact was so much greater than if we had either been doing it on our own or doing it in sort of a formally traditional way. So I think those are the things that we're seeing is more trust, more co-design, more listening to communities, gaining their input in different ways, creating less burden and administrative overhead. One thing we were able to do in COVID, we really tested these models out in some ways, you know, giving unrestricted operating support, saying, hey, forget trying to fit the mode here. You're doing this good work in this way that as a partner, we want to support you. Here's the funding. This is, and instead of a long written report, maybe there's other ways of sharing the impact back to the foundation. So we've explored and we'll continue to experiment with that to make things easier for those who are doing the really important work in our communities.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, because I want to share a brief story. I went to see one of our grantees last week that we're highlighting in our annual appeal. So stay tuned for everyone on the call to find out who that is. And they shared with me that the funding received from us really opened up what they were able to do in serving the particular children in their community. And the fact that it was unrestricted really enabled them to take their thinking of what they originally wanted to do with their project to the next level, and provided creativity and flexibility to get laptops for kids, which is something that they never did versus just providing backpacks. So again, stay tuned on who this particular grantee is, but it really just speaks to exactly what you just said. And this grantee also shared that because they don't have to spend a lot of time with reporting on what they actually did with the money, they have that time to go back out into the community and deposit their energy there. So I really think we're not fully there yet, not saying that we've got it perfected, but we're really trying to speak to exactly what you just mentioned. So thank you for providing that.
And Bianca, I just want to underscore what these trends and these models that we're seeing and that we're engaged in learning more about is mostly foundations, larger, sort of more formalized funding. We're also seeing this on individual levels. And I think that's what you and Daisy and others on the team are creating this learning series to explore as individuals, how to have greater impact in the communities and how to evolve individual philanthropy. Our own philanthropy can evolve and can have greater impact in very similar ways, maybe not exactly the same because maybe individuals aren't taking applications, but this idea of sort of the unrestricted approach, the multi-year commitments in advance so folks know that they can count on. I mean, some of it is totally intuitive. People have been doing it for years, and others is new, or combining them all is even more powerful.
Katie, can you speak to what changes we have specifically made to meet the changing face of philanthropy?
Wow, we've a lot. I mean, we've been redesigning our work, just as I said, and some of that had to do with the emergency response. We were able to stop the way we were doing things. I mean, totally put a complete stop to it last March and completely readjust. And that kind of opportunity, I'll say that, gave us the chance to experiment, adapt, learn from. So I think I mentioned at the very beginning this, we had folks who joined with us to make hundreds and hundreds of phone calls every week to nonprofits, to community leaders, to legislators up and down the region, April, May, June, July, August, just trying to better understand the lay of the land. So we were being much more proactive. We were making it, we initially wanted to hear from folks online and get information, but that turned out to be burdensome. We wanted them to be doing the work in the community that was needed. So we simply wanted to come to them and not have to have an application. So we removed that whole application process. We made grants based on conversations and trust. And so that was, very different from our past behaviors. And we reduced the reporting responsibilities. We did have an application for support in our in a stabilization grant opportunity last fall, but we did some different things there in terms of asking different questions about diversity of leadership of both the executive leadership team at the organization, but also at the board level. And we prioritized our grants through stabilization based on our strategic priorities, based on those we knew would be most adversely affected by the pandemic, and those who were working towards a more diverse and inclusive organization. So I think, there's lots of things that we've been doing. We're doing lots of training and exploring and learning. And partnering with other organizations who've been doing this work in this way and learning from them.
Thank you. I'm going to pin Daisy back in. I believe she has another question for the audience for you.
Great.
Yes. So we have a question. In general, foundations have shied away from general operating support. Does the long-term partnership concept run counter to this? And does this speak to a need for PFs to rethink their reluctance to get involved in long-term operating support?
Can you repeat the first part? Are you hearing that
I think the question is getting at that funders in general have shied away from general unrestricted support.
Right.
You see that there would be a shift in this, as you've described the changes that are happening in philanthropy. Do you think that funders would get involved in long-term operating support?
I think that is happening. Yeah, I think that is happening. The sort of tradition, thank you, Daisy. I think the traditional concern that I've heard over the years with funders around operating support is, what if we can't continue it? We won't be able to continue it forever, sort of that acknowledgement. We can't do it beyond 3 years or 5 years. And so what will happen as a result? And I think the changing philosophy around this is, we're in partnership. What do you need beyond dollars? I mean, that's another piece of this that we are definitely doing much more with and looking to do even more with going forward, is that funding is really important. I mean, anyone who's running a nonprofit, who's you're working for a nonprofit who's on this call knows how important cash is, okay? I'm not saying it's not, but there are other additional supports that are valuable, whether it's access to data or convening and creating cohort learning opportunities, technical assistance, you name it. So additional options. And I think if you go into a partnership in an agreement with, here's the trajectory. It's a 5-year trajectory. It's a 10-year trajectory. And we're going to work together to ensure that you have the ability to continue this beyond our funding as a funder, for example. So I think there's a more intentional, planful approach that has to happen with this kind of a longer term partnership if you're supporting either project-based or unrestricted operating support. If Daisy, if you don't think I answered that question, if I wasn't on target, let me know. And if there's another question, I'd be happy to have it.
We do actually have one more question, and then we can transition into wrapping up for the morning.
Katie, I think you did answer that question. And it's, yes, we're seeing that funders are interested in partnering more long-term. And when we're talking about funders, this is foundations and individuals looking at that true partnership as we move through a new landscape. We have one more question, and it goes this way. Early in the conversation, there was a discussion of Western Mass being noticed by Boston area funders and benefiting from their unprecedented generosity. Sorry, I've got to scroll down here. In light of COVID, understood that we don't know exactly why that happened, but how is CFWM working to stay on the radar of these foundations and funders and make the case that our region needs long-term support?
Great question. Well, we're doing what you all would do who are on the call, which is, as a lot of good stewardship, staying in touch with, providing, updates and reports on impact and continued need. We're staying connected. I mean, I think one of the things about, I've been talk about this, that it can be done, that we can partner with sort of different size organizations and institutions in ways that help communities that wouldn't have access to the kind of philanthropy that you might access in New York City or Chicago, Atlanta, or Boston. So I think telling the story over and over again and staying in close contact with those folks who have been supportive. Another example is the Mass COVID Relief Fund that was launched by First Lady Lauren Baker. That was primarily seeded with funding from the private foundations in the Boston area. And they had several opportunities for conversations with the funders, which I was able to attend, tell the story of our region, and to encourage for continued support. And that actually has resulted in some additional support. I think the Philanthropy Massachusetts giving report data is startling, and to be able to describe the fact that the difference between the Boston area and Hampden County or Hampshire or Franklin County is so stark and so different. It is exactly on par with the difference between how much philanthropy is available in the Mississippi Delta versus New York City. So it's the same, it's the same differential in terms of philanthropy, what we have available to us. If you're just simply looking at what funding is here in our region compared to what's funding is available in the Boston region. And we recognize, and I'm saying this is, per capita, not, so I think telling the story over and over again has really been important. And I look to all of you, if you have suggestions, if you have folks to connect to, we welcome that as well.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. Hearing about all of this in one setting is really, really excited. Again, the impact that we will see in our region in the future is definitely undoubtable. I would also like to thank everyone for joining us on the call today. Please be on the lookout for our upcoming session, where Rima Dayal will be discussing how philanthropy can be used as a tool to build equity in our communities. The conversation will continue. So I hope you all have a great remainder of your week and an even better weekend. And thank you all again for joining us today.
Thank you, Bianca, and thanks to everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. Be well. Take care.